The NFL Combine is a great reminder that there is a difference between what you say and why you say it. We're going to try to make sense of which is which with Mike McDaniel speaking to the media here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft Lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special shout out and welcome to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. Here on the Locked On Network, we don't just say it, we live it. If you're not an everydayer, it's NFL Combine Week. What a great time to start tuning in every day and kind of keeping up with the pulse of the team and the league here on Locked On Dolphins. Mike McDaniel spoke about an hour and a half ago here in Indianapolis. I'm here at my Airbnb in downtown Indy. Just walked back from the convention center. Was there for the Mike McDaniel presser, in which we got a lot. Now, what of it is authentic? What of it is calculated? What of it is intentional, partial truths? These are the things that we're going to be racking our brain over for anywhere from the next 2.5 weeks to the next maybe 6 months, depending on the player and the situation and so on and so forth. And it's the fun part of the offseason. It's also an exhausting part of the offseason, and mercifully, the league calendar year is not too far away. So we'll get some clarity and some truths on some of the things that Mike McDaniel shared sooner rather than later. But I want to start today's show where Mike McDaniel started his presser, which was he was asked about Terron Armstead, and if Terron Armstead had made a decision on whether or not he was going to play. And Mike here was very transparent. Now, he didn't come right out and say, Terron Armstead's not going to be with the football team next year. But he did say Terron is not quite ready to make his decision yet. So the Miami Dolphins organizationally are planning and moving forward with the intention that Terron Armstead will not be on the team for the sake of the draft and free agency. Now, what that ultimately means from a dollars and cents perspective, there's a number of different outcomes here. There could be Terron decides to play and agrees to play again on an amended contract for reduced salary, and the Dolphins keep him and his cap number goes down and he plays this year. That's a possible outcome. Another possible outcome is Terron decides to retire. And if Terron decides to retire, the team then has a choice of, do we want to just process his retirement, say $4.25 million against the cap, take an $18 million dead cap hit for money we've paid him in past years that's prorated out in the future years that we have to account for from salary cap, and then free up $23 million in cap space in 2026? Or do we want to restructure, I'm using air quotes if you're listening to the show, restructure his base salary down from 13.3 to the veteran minimum so that the team in the short term can save about $12 million in cap space and then process his retirement post June 1st. So you could split that $18 million in dead cap between this year, which would be the 2025 prorated amount, and then the rest of it goes to 2026, and you save less in 2026, but you have more cap space and more operating cap space in 2025 for the first and second waves of free agency until June rolls around and you could process that retirement. Or does Terron decide to play and you decide to cut or trade Terron Armstead, right? So there's a lot of outcomes that still have yet to be closed off on kind of this fork in the road that you're at with Terron Armstead. But the fact that I think it is significant that Mike McDaniel disclosed that the team is currently operating with an expectation that they will not have Terron Armstead on the team. If Terron decides, I think the easiest, the best thing, the most convenient thing that could happen for the team is Terron decides to retire, because that takes the ball out of everybody's hands and it simply becomes, do we take the cap charge up front and clear up all the cap space for 2026, or do we split and divide and prorate out the cap charge and access more salary cap savings in 2025 at the expense of completely wiping clean his money for 2026? I don't have that answer. We will see what answer we get when a formal decision is ultimately made or a transaction's made. But that wasn't the only offensive line related topic that came up in this press conference. Mike McDaniel was asked about the interior with the guards. And his theme was kind of similar across multiple positions, whether that was running back or the offensive line, talking about the incomplete element of the room and that being an exciting thing. Talking about the players that are in place, whether that's at running back with Devon Achane and Jalen Wright, or whether that's on the offensive line with Aaron Brewer and Austin Jackson and a second-year player in Patrick Paul. Knowing what you have in those players and being excited for the opportunity to kind of reset and rebuild around those players. And, you know, if the Dolphins had a little bit more liquidity in their salary cap situation, I think a lot of people would probably be in the same boat of enthusiasm. I think right now the general perception around the team is there's too many needs and not enough space, and it's going to be compromised, and you're not going to go out and sign the best player in free agency at every spot. But I also don't think that's the pathway for success forward anyway. I think we've gone over this on the show. I think the more that you can identify right fits that aren't motivated by maximizing financial gains, players that maybe weren't right fits coming off rookie contracts and are young players in the prime of their careers, that you could extrapolate their skills and put it within your ecosystem, that maybe aren't break the bank type of players. That's how free agency in a perfect world, I think, would work and should work. And the Dolphins have the chance to do every bit of that. Now, he was asked about the interior of the offensive line, and he acknowledged this is likely going to be a two-pronged approach where you have contributions in free agency and you have contributions in the NFL draft. And he came straight out and said, no, this is a time to invest in this group. It's a great time to have needs in this group, and we're going to invest in it. And we have a few guys in free agency who we have as targets that we think we can come to agreements to. And so I think that tells you, without telling you explicitly who these players are, I think it tells you that they have an understanding of what their budget is. I think they have an understanding of the budget or the players that are going to fall in that price range. And it seems like they have some players that they like. The draft element of it, I think it would be irresponsible to exclusively, especially if you're going out and say you sign a guy like a James Daniels, who's coming off of a season-ending injury last year, or Will Hernandez, who's coming off of a season-ending injury last year, right? Those are two of the more accomplished guards that are going to be on the market, but they both come with an acknowledgement of they were hurt at the end of the year last year. And for all of the jokes about how they're perfect for the Dolphins, spare me. You know, you play this game long enough, everybody gets hurt. And those guys collectively have a pretty respectable resume of being healthy. Now, the challenge is the age and the likelihood of reoccurrence of another injury because they're players that are getting older. And what does that mean for your price point? And how do you protect yourself from that risk? Well, because you did this song and dance with Isaiah Wynn last year, and it went nuclear and blew up in your face. And you were left without any upgrades. But as of right now, Mike McDaniel communicating on the podium, the Dolphins operating with an expectation at this point in time that they will not have Terron Armstead on the roster. Patrick Paul, you're up. And expect multiple free agent signings on the offensive line and probably an opportunity in the draft as well. So as I continue to do mock drafts to get you ready for April, and I continue to not pick an offensive lineman at 13, please have an understanding. That's why a lot of these mocks that I've done don't have the Dolphins going offensive line at 13, because I think they're going to sign multiple starting caliber players, and then they will have less pressure to force the pick and can let the board come to them at an appropriate point in the draft. Tyreek Hill got a little bit of buzz during the podium session. We're going to get into that next. Stick with us. I want to give a shout out to Cam Wolf. I was wearing his maroon t-shirt, I had maroon sneakers, and then I had black pants and a black jacket. It was like maroon and black. It's a little, I'm usually aqua and orange and white are the colors I usually roll with. So went off character a little bit, and I get there, and Cam's wearing maroon and black, but Cam's wearing like the best looking suit I've ever seen in my entire life. Maroon and black, maroon suit, black undershirt, dressed to kill. I'm like, man, I'm not even the best guy wearing maroon and black here today. So Cam, it was great to see. It was great to see a bunch of guys on the beat. Marcel Louis Jacques getting married here in a couple weeks. Congratulations to him. Travis Wingfield, David Feronis, the whole gang, Joe Shad, saw Joe Shad. It's great to see all you guys, and good to catch up a little bit, and hope to run into you guys throughout the course of the week. But Mike McDaniel asked about Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, of course, on Instagram, he's wearing his big cast on his wrist. Mike McDaniel did confirm that Tyreek Hill had surgery on his wrist. He made sure to point out that it was a ligament issue that was repaired. Mike also went out of his way to disclose that Tyreek is going to be using the spring for his conditioning and running, and then will be cleared for full football activities sometime around the summertime. So it's a helpful update around Tyreek Hill. But here's the thing. This is where it's not necessarily what you're saying, but it's why are you saying it? And I don't want to continue to just perpetuate or dismiss the idea that Tyreek Hill might be back on the football team next year. And that was the reports that went out from the national media at the beginning of the offseason cycle, right? And I know that those things are typically shared for a reason. But that is very out of character. It is very out of character for Mike McDaniel to step up to the podium and disclose publicly a player's injury, what the player was, whether the player had surgery, what the player's timeline and timetable is for return to football. Like that is the quintessential in-season Mike McDaniel checklist of do not ask me about these things because I'm not going to answer them. And now it's the NFL Combine, and we get up in front of the national media and the local media and everybody else in attendance. And we go so far as to not only tell you what it was and what the injury was, and the disclosure of the injury flies directly in the face of what the injury was stated to be by Hill and his representation. You also go as far as to say is what his recovery timeline looks like and when he's going to return to football activities. like, you know what I mean? Now, you could be trying to do this for a number of different reasons. You could look at this through the lens of kind of taking back the narrative around what Hill's play was this past season. And it had been disclosed by Mike McDaniel that they had communicated to Tyreek Hill that quitting on your team is not going to be a cool thing to do moving forward. But more often than not, when you do decide to quit on a team, you're usually not back with the team. And I think that's why the trade stuff is going to it's going to continue to be a thing of will they, won't they, until you get to the end of August, because the end of August is when he has an $18.85 or a $15.85 million option bonus that the Dolphins have to sign a check for. And if they sign that check, he's going to play on the team. But until that date, I'm not going to dismiss the possibility that Tyreek Hill gets traded. And I couldn't help but think, when it was disclosed, Tyreek Hill's not going to be with the team doing football activities until the summertime. You're going to have minicamp and OTAs, and you're not going to have Tyreek Hill on site participating in those events. And most of those events are non-mandatory. But even if they were, he's not going to be participating on the field and catching the football because apparently, per Mike McDaniel's disclosures, he is not going to be cleared for football activity and catching the ball with his wrist. So that, for me, I'm not upset about that. Now you have to let the offseason come to you. You have to see what you can do in the wide receiver room. You have to see what you can do in the tight end room. You have to see how the draft falls your way and what your personnel looks like to be able to field an offense potentially without Tyreek Hill, because he's been the focal point of the entire offensive operation for 2 out of 3 seasons. And even this past year, when he wasn't getting the targets at the volume that he was in years past, he's still a central figure in the mechanics of the offense. But now you have OTAs and minicamp potentially without Tyreek Hill as a chance to see how things look and how things operate with the other names that you have on the roster and in the wide receiver room and whoever you add in the draft, to kind of get a feel for what that can look like. Maybe they go through that process and they say, you know what, it's just not in the cards. We're going to play with fire and potentially risk it all to bring Tyreek Hill back, and because we need him for the operation of our offense. Or you can gain a little bit of confidence throughout that window of those guys that are getting time on task and reps, and this time away for Tyreek Hill, is presumably going to have him more often than not separate from the team. I just think there's a lot of smoke here, and I hate doing like the galaxy brain, big brain speculation type of stuff. But my alarm bells just start going off when Mike McDaniel gets up in front of a microphone and gives you the polar opposite of what his mode of operations is as far as handling player privacy and injuries. That to me, just it's setting off some alarm bells as something to watch, and why I will continue to not completely dismiss the idea that Tyreek Hill does not play on the Miami Dolphins, regardless of what the reporting was at the beginning of the offseason, from the big media people who more often than not are talking to the higher ups from these teams to get these reports. And it may be of motivation to have the reports out there at this stage in the game that the Dolphins are not trading Tyreek Hill. 6 months. Almost to the day. 6 months, potentially. If the football gods have any mercy after the season that we just went through, we will not be subjected to 6 months of will they, won't they on this run. We can only pray to the football gods. Now, there were some other odds and ends of note throughout this press conference. We're getting to those next. Make sure you guys stick with us. Mike was asked a very interesting question pertaining to his support staff, his assistant coaches. And the Dolphins have one of the bigger pools of coaching assistants of any team across the league. And Mike was asked about the motivation behind that and being worried about, having too many influences from a coaching perspective. And I liked his answer as far as the thought process and the why, but it also kind of makes me look at a couple of different players in a different light. The long and the short of it was Mike said, our intent of having a surplus of coaches available effectively in each position room is so that every player on the roster can be given the attention that they need to try to develop, whether they are a top half of the roster player, one of the best players on the roster, or they're a bottom half fringe 53-man roster type of player. By having more coaches, there can be more resources to the players, where it's very easy once you get into the season for the focus to be on the guys that are getting the reps throughout the week, because you got to prep, and those guys need the practice reps to get ready to play the game. And I think it's a great bit of insight into a why for the Dolphins and why they have retained a lot of assistants in rooms. And I know that there's been a conversation about, for example, Darrell Bevel with Bobby Slowick and Frank Smith and Mike McDaniel and those influences in the passing game. And that's not necessarily direct one for one, because those aren't position coaches and assistants. But having a pretty robust coaching staff, I think that's a great idea. But here's the thing. It makes me look at players like Channing Tindall and Eric Ezukanma and Cam Smith differently. Now, the Dolphins have a number of successful stories of player development and turning players into better professionals than what the investment that they took to get those players would seem to suggest they are destined for, even in the Mike McDaniel era. But you have guys that were, I don't want to say faces of draft classes, but I mean, Cam Smith was a second-round pick. Tindall and Ezukanma were not top 100 picks. I think that does change your expectation for a player when they're regardless of whether they're the first players in your class or not. So I want to be fair, but at the same time, like Channing Tindall now, having been exposed to the coaching that he has and having a deeper and more robust coaching staff at their disposal, and Cam Smith for 2 years for two different coaching staffs, getting lapped by undrafted free agents in the form of Storm Duck and Ethan Bonner for playing time opportunities. If those players aren't making that developmental leap, despite you investing in more coaches to have more resources available to players so that players, regardless of where they are on the depth chart, get the resources that they need to become better players, it kind of makes me look at you differently. Like, it's kind of like, okay, well, then what are we doing here? Like, are we gonna use a 53-man roster spot on Channing Tindall in year 4 as a developmental player that hasn't developed, and he can't get past Duke Riley, and Tyrell Dotson gets here and on waivers and steps in immediately and plays? Are we gonna really do this song and dance with Cam Smith again? After 2 years of some soft tissue type stuff, a bunch of injuries, didn't seem like Vic Fangio ever was keen to trust him as a rookie. We all wanted him to play. I don't know what those dynamics are because I'm not in the room. But I know if you're going to invest a whole bunch of extra for extra coaches to have extra impressions on players to give them what they need to get better, regardless of where you were picked or what the investment was in you as a player. If you're for multiple years, you're stagnant or you're not making the leaps that would seem to be suggestive of where you were drafted for, what are we doing? Why are we doing whatever we're doing? You know what I mean? And the other thing that Mike had that I thought was, I appreciated this insight from Mike McDaniel. It was evaluating play and results. And it falls in line with something that I've talked about on the show a number of times, which is the complexity and depth of, like, there's so many shades of gray to the answers in which you're looking for. As a football fan who loves the Dolphins and tunes into this show, presumably, you're probably sitting here and at some point last season or at some point this offseason or at some point in the last couple of years, you've asked yourself, like, man, like, how come we just haven't had success in the way that we want to aspire to have success? And everybody, handles that question differently when you have a letdown season like 2024 was. And you have people on one end of the spectrum who say, well, if Tua Tagovailoa doesn't get hurt, they win a couple more games, they're a playoff team. And that's factually true. I do believe that. Now, does that excuse the shortcomings of the ideology of the football team? No. And I think you would just be putting off the inevitable of having some difficult conversations anyway that still need to be had. And I would say the fact that you had a year like the year you had kind of forces you to look yourself in the mirror and how you're doing things and hopefully create and facilitate some change that's necessary change in your football ideology. But then the other side of the spectrum is everybody stinks. Tua stinks. Mike McDaniel stinks. Chris Greer stinks. The offensive line stinks. Everything's bad. And it's because blanket statement or singular all-encompassing statement. And Mike talked about, evaluating any player performance, the compounding variables that exist that you have to kind of filter and work through with certain things that are uncontrollable for an individual player, right? And I think that can be applicable for a team too. And I think that's the thing that, like, I aspire to do this on this program, is to be able to compartmentalize and talk about a singular variable while acknowledging all of the other compounding variables that exist around that, to try to offer like a microscopic and a 30,000 foot view of the strengths and the weaknesses and the pros and the cons and the challenges of the team at any given point in time. So I just appreciated hearing that from him, because that's been a part of what I have tried to offer in messaging and content that, if I'm being honest, I recognize wholeheartedly. There's some people that are pissed off after the Dolphins lose a game, and they don't want to get online, and they don't want to listen to me talk even keeled about schematically what the failure was here, or what this player did or didn't do and how it could have been different, and hear about the players that did execute well. You want to be mad. I just don't, I can't feed that. I don't want to feed that. I don't want to be the knee-jerk, overreactionary, network television style of brash, unnecessarily binary type of analysis. So I enjoyed that from Mike. That's just me. That's going to do it for us here today on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team. Every day, Mike McDaniel speaking at the NFL Combine. Some interesting comments. Which ones of them were said as truths? Which one of them were said intentionally the way that they were said for a reason? That's what the weeks ahead hold, and hopefully not, but potentially months ahead hold for the Dolphins. I'm Kyle Krabs, back tomorrow with more Miami Dolphins coverage here from the NFL Combine. Hope to see you then. Go Fins.